You are no longer the princess of our kingdom. I have been thinking of what to do to you, he continued. I considered many options, but I decided to be generous. Instead of throwing you out of the palace like the worthless pig you are, you will stay here. But from now on, you are nothing more than a maid. The people of Ora were plunged into deep sadness, their hearts heavy with fear and sorrow when the search party finally returned. Their faces were long and full of despair. The villagers didn't even need to hear their words to know the truth. The king was still nowhere to be found. It had been 20 long days since King Onwara disappeared without a trace. His people, who loved him so dearly, had searched day and night, hoping for some sign of him. The brave village warriors, the loyal palace guards, and even the villagers themselves had scoured every corner of the kingdom. They searched the forest, the mountains, and the farthest lands beyond their borders. Yet, there was no sign of the king. The fishermen too had done their part. They rowed their boats far and wide, exploring every river and stream, even venturing into the hidden places they had never gone before. But still, the king could not be found. It was as if he had vanished into thin air, leaving behind nothing but confusion and sadness. This was not just an ordinary king. King Onwara had ruled Ora Kingdom with wisdom and kindness for more than 20 years. His reign was the most peaceful time the village had ever known. Under his leadership, the people had flourished and the village had prospered. He was loved by all, young and old, rich and poor. He treated everyone with fairness, compassion, and generosity. The people often prayed to the gods to protect him, to keep him healthy and strong, because they could not imagine their kingdom without him. But now, with his sudden disappearance, the unthinkable had happened. It was a shock no one saw coming. The village was not just worried, they were terrified. What could have happened to their beloved king? Where could he be? And why had he vanished so suddenly? The day the search party returned empty-handed, the entire kingdom fell into a heavy silence. It was as if even nature itself sensed the weight of the grief hanging over the people. Men stood still, their faces wet with tears. Women wept openly, their cries echoing through the streets. Children, too young to fully understand, still felt the sorrow in the air and screamed in confusion. The animals were quiet, as though they too were mourning the loss of the king. A dark cloud of sorrow covered the entire kingdom, and it felt as if the sun itself refused to shine. No one had ever heard of such a thing. A king disappearing without a word, without a trace. It was a mystery that left the people of Ora Kingdom in despair, their hearts filled with questions and their souls weighed down by fear and sadness. They all concluded that the king was dead. There was no other explanation to this. It was possible that some wild animals had eaten him up. The entire kingdom was still mourning the loss of their beloved King Onwara. 7 long days had passed since the king had been declared dead, but the sadness in the air felt as thick as ever. The villagers' cries had quieted down, but their hearts remained heavy, unsure of what would happen next. It was at this point that the elders and titled men in the kingdom, the wisest and most respected leaders, decided to gather They needed to figure out what the future of the kingdom would look like, especially since the king had no son to take his place on the throne. Everyone gathered beneath the enormous udara tree, a tree so large that its branches spread wide, providing shade to all who sat under it. But this day, the air was heavy with sadness and uncertainty. The men sat with their heads down, faces gloomy, spitting in disgust and frustration. Some of them muttered, "Alumelo," meaning something terrible has befallen us. They flapped their fingers, a sign of their deep displeasure as they tried to make sense of the tragedy. After a long silence, Onowu the kingmaker cleared his throat. His voice, though steady, carried the weight of sorrow and responsibility. The big question now is, where do we go from here? He asked, looking at the faces of other elders. From everything we've seen, it seems our king is dead. We need to keep the kingdom running smoothly until the 7 days of mourning is over, as the laws of our land demand. After that, we will call the chief priest to find out who the gods have chosen to be our next king. As we all know that the king had no son, we must follow the gods' will. The elders listened carefully, nodding their head in agreement. Omalicha, one of the elders' statesmen, spoke up. "Onowu, what you have said is true and wise. We cannot leave the kingdom without leadership for 70 days. Someone has to guide the people during this time. I suggest we choose a 7-man cabinet from amongst us to take charge of the kingdom's affairs until the mourning period is over. Onowu, you know those who truly care for the people. I suggest you appoint them and let's move on. Do we all agree?" "Yes," supported, echoed the voices of the elders, their spirits slightly lifted by the sense of direction. They were about to proceed with their plan when suddenly a loud, angry voice broke through the quiet of the gathering. "What is going on here?" The voice belonged to Emenike, the king's brother. He stormed into the meeting, his eyes wild with fury, followed by a gang of thugs who looked ready for a fight. "Will you shut your mouth?" Onowu scolded, standing up to face Emenike. "Don't you have respect for the titled men of this kingdom?" But Emenike was not intimidated. His face was twisted with anger and his voice boomed even louder. "Onowu, I ask you again, what is going on here?" Onowu clenched his fist, trying to control his rage, but as he looked at Emenike's fiery eyes, he realized that this confrontation was about to turn ugly. Ichie Madu, another elder, quickly spoke up, his voice shaky. "We are selecting members of the cabinet to oversee the kingdom's affair during the 70 days of mourning," he explained, hoping to calm the situation. Emenike let out a wicked laugh, his face hardening into a cruel sneer. "You all will do no such thing," he barked. "In 3 days, Onowu, you will summon the chief priest to the palace. On that day, you will crown me king, or you die," Emenike commanded. The elders gasped in horror as Emenike's thugs stepped forward menacingly. "As for you foolish elders," Emenike continued, his voice filled with venom, "you will either follow my orders or prepare to die also. The kingdom, the throne, everything belongs to me. Now that my brother is gone, I will take what is rightfully mine." The elders sat frozen in disbelief, staring at Emenike, their hearts filled with fear. But Onowu began to speak. "Call me king," Emenike screamed, cutting him off. his eyes blazing with madness. Onowu, trying to keep some control over the situation, lowered his voice. "My king," he said reluctantly, "we are still mourning our king, your brother, and it's against the laws of the land to crown a king while mourning. King Onuora is your brother, and secondly, the gods rejected you once and chose your younger brother to be king. We cannot make you the king, else calamity comes upon the land." Emenike's face grew even darker. "One more word from you, Onowu, and I will cut off your head and feed it to the birds," he threatened. His voice was cold and full of hatred. "Damn the gods! Who are the gods? Those useless, clueless beings? What do they know? They stole my throne from me once, but this time they won't stop me. I am Emenike, the true son of my father. In 3 days, Onowu, you will crown me king, or there will be bloodshed in this kingdom. Whatever other meeting you're having here should be about my coronation ceremony in 3 days." With that, Emenike turned and stormed off, his dogs following closely behind. The elders sat stunned in silence, too frightened to speak, their minds racing with the terrifying possibilities of what might happen next. They watched Emenike's back until he disappeared from their sight, and still not a single word was spoken. Fear and confusion hung in the air like a heavy fog as the elders realized they were facing a new and dangerous challenge, one that could destroy their beloved kingdom. Onowu sat in front of his small hut, his heart heavy with the weight of everything that had just happened. His mind was spinning as he thought about Emenike's wicked threats. Deep down, Onowu had already made a decision. There was no way he would ever be a part of this evil. He loved his people too much to betray them. By crowning a man like Emenike king, King Onuora had been a good and just ruler, and Onowu would rather die than place the Ofo, the staff of power, into the hands of a tyrant like Emenike. Emenike, the first son of King Ozobata, had always been a terror. Everyone in the kingdom knew him for what he was: lazy, cruel, selfish, and arrogant. The villagers lived in fear of the day he might ever become king. He was nothing like his younger brother Onuora, who was humble, kind, and full of wisdom. People often wondered how two brothers raised by the same parents could be so completely different. When their father Ozobata died, rumors spread throughout the kingdom that Emenike had poisoned him to get the throne, as his death was sudden. But the gods, seeing the evil in his heart, rejected him. Emenike tried to force his way to power, grabbing the sacred Ofo by force, but the gods struck him down with leprosy as punishment. His younger brother Onuora was chosen by the gods and crowned king, which came as a big relief to the entire kingdom. Emenike fled the village after that, disappearing into the unknown. Many years passed before Emenike returned. When he did, he was completely transformed. His skin was clear of the leprosy and he looked healthy. He had married in a strange land and brought back a family with him. At first, he came humbly, making peace with his brother the king. Onuora, being the kind and forgiving man he was, welcomed him back without any suspicion. The villagers were relieved, thinking that Emenike had changed. But Onowu had always been cautious. He had warned the king to be careful with Emenike. But King Onuora, with his soft heart, had dismissed his warnings. Now, sitting alone, Honora realized that his worst fears had come true. Emenike's thirst for the throne had never died down. In fact, his ambition to become king had only grown stronger during his time away. I have always warned the king about his brother, Onowu muttered to himself as he stared at the flickering light of his lantern. I told him to tread with caution. Now, look what has happened. Who knows, maybe Emenike had a hand in his brother's death. A man fighting for the throne while his own brother's mourning period hasn't even ended. This is a terrible abomination. Onowu's thoughts were filled with dread. He knew something horrible was coming. Emenike was a man without conscience, and he had made it clear that he would stop at nothing to claim the throne. The entire kingdom was in danger, and Onowu could feel it deep in his bones. He could not stay and watch as this evil unfolded. One thing was sure: he would never give Emenike the satisfaction of shedding his own blood. Onowu glanced at the small hut where his family slept, unaware of the storm that was about to break. He loved his family too much to put them in danger. He had to leave, and he had to do it before dawn. At midnight, he whispered to himself, I will take my family, and we will leave this village. We will go far away where Emenike's madness cannot reach us. With his heart set, Onowu rose to his feet and began making quiet preparations. His supposed coronation was just one day away, and the Onowu was nowhere to be found. The elders sat under the tree, their faces looking pale and confused as they thought of what to do. They knew Emenike was an evil man, but there was nothing they could do about it other than support him. He had called for this meeting, and as they waited, their hearts were heavy with pain and sorrow as they wondered what his plans were. Soon, the sound of galloping horses echoed through the village. It was Emenike and his gang of thugs, riding with an air of arrogance and menace. The elders shifted nervously as Emenike dismounted his horse and approached them with a wicked grin on his face. Without a word, he dropped a large bag of money in front of them. The clinking sound of the coins was almost deafening. Here is my token, Emenike said, his grin widening. And there is still plenty from where it came from. I, Emenike, know how to reward those who stand by me. The elders exchanged uneasy glances, their eyes flickering between the money and the wicked figure before them. I will ascend the throne tomorrow, Emenike declared with a booming voice. And everyone here must support me. He pointed a finger directly at Nduka, one of the senior elders. Nduka, you are the next in line after Onowu Ibe. Since the coward is nowhere to be found, you will take his place and crown me king tomorrow. Am I understood? His voice thundered through the gathering, making everyone jump. Yes, yes, my lord, Nduka stammered, his face pale with fear. Good, Emenike backed with satisfaction. Anyone who dares to go against me will face death. Inform the chief priest that he is to come to the palace tomorrow for my coronation. Emenike let out a cruel mocking laughter before mounting on his horse again and riding off with his dogs. As soon as Emenike was gone, the elders let out a collective sigh of relief. The tension eased for a moment, but the weight of the situation still pressed down on them. What were they going to do? Ozo Madu, one of the most respected elders, broke the silence. What do we do from here? His voice was quiet but firm, trying to steady the trembling hearts of the other elders. Nduka looked down at the ground, tears welling up in his eyes. Emenike is a dangerous man, he said quietly, his voice shaking. Our families are at risk. We will have to do as he says. If it pleases the gods, let them stay silent. I will inform the chief priest, and we will do as he demands. As for this money, Nduka added, pushing the bags of coin away, I have no interest in it. Another elder cleared his throat, his face etched with worry, but his eyes lingered on the bag of money. My family has not eaten for days, he said softly. My crops failed this season, and I have no other way to feed them. I need this money. Nduka, we have to accept our reality. Emenike is now king, and if we want to live peacefully in this kingdom, we must support him. Another elder nodded in agreement. You have spoken the truth, he said. There is an old saying, if you can't beat them, join them. As things stand, we can't challenge Emenike. He has too much power. Let's share this money. My family needs it. We all need it. If anyone wants to reject his, I will gladly take his share. After all, what have I ever gained since I became a chief? Wham! Some elders supported. Ozo Madu, his face flushed with anger, slammed his fists down. You are a disgrace. You all are a disgrace, he shouted. I agree with Nduka. We may not be able to stop Emenike, but we cannot sell our conscience for a few bags of coins. Do you not see what is happening here? This is an abomination. Shut up and let's share this money. Stop pretending to be a saint, came a voice from behind. One of the elders, clearly fed up, had had enough of Ozo Madu's protest. His outburst sparked a loud argument among the group. The once united council of elders was now torn apart. Some sided with Emenike, thinking of their survival and the needs of their families. Others, like Ozo Madu, refused to give in, even if it meant risking their lives. Voices were raised, fingers were pointed, and tempers flared. The evening grew darker as the elders shouted at one another under the ancient Udara tree, their division clear for all to see. What had once been a wise and strong council had now fallen into chaos, just as the kingdom was about to fall into the hands of a man who would rule with cruelty and greed. Amidst the mourning of the king, rumors flew around the village as people whispered in hushed tones. No one dared to speak publicly, or he or she risked death. No proper funeral has been organized for the king, and here was Emenike trying to ascend the throne. This was a great abomination. The day of the coronation finally arrived, and the atmosphere in the palace was thick with tension. Emenike, dressed in royal attire and surrounded by his thugs, and the council of elders sat proudly on the throne, his eyes gleaming with arrogance. The elders, their faces pale and their spirits broken, stood nearby, knowing full well that they were participating in something deeply wrong, but too frightened to act. Soon, the distant sound of a bell echoed through the palace, signaling the arrival of the chief priest. The heavy, steady ringing only added to the sense of unease that hung in the air. As the chief priest approached, his face showed the marks of his old age, but it was his expression that caught everyone's attention. His heart was clearly heavy, and the weight of the moment was evident in his weary steps. Emenike, "You sent for me," the chief priest Ikenna said as he entered the palace. His voice was steady but filled with sorrow as he addressed Emenike, who was already seated on the throne as though he had been crowned king. "Yes, I did," Emenike replied arrogantly. "The law of the land states that you must be present to hand over the offer as a sign that the gods have recognized my kingship." The chief priest stared at Emenike with a look of deep disgust, his eyes narrowing in disapproval. "I told you 20 years ago, Emenike," Ikenna began, his voice rising in anger. "The gods rejected you as king because of your evil heart. And now, once again, the gods have refused your ascension to the throne. I, Ikenna, will rather die than go against the will of the gods." Emenike's face twisted with fury as he leaped to his feet, shouting, "No, I am not afraid of your useless gods. You must do as I command." The chief priest stood his ground, his voice unwavering. "May the gods strike me dead if I try to do such a thing," he declared boldly. "You are a cursed man, Emenike, and you will bring ruin to this land if you are crowned." At those words, something snapped inside Emenike. His eyes blazed with uncontrollable rage. Without warning, he grabbed a sword from one of the guards beside him. In a single swift motion, he swung the blade and struck down the chief priest. The sharp sound of metal cutting through the air, followed by the sickening thud of Ikenna's body hitting the ground. Blood splattered across the floor as the once proud chief priest lay motionless. The entire palace fell into a shocked silence, the air thick with horror. Emenike stood over the lifeless body of the chief priest, his sword dripping with blood. His eyes blazed like a madman's as he paced back and forth, his chest heaving with anger. "Who else dares to challenge me?" he shouted, his voice echoing off the palace walls. "Who else wants to die today?" The elders and some of the villagers who had gathered stood frozen in terror, their hearts gripped by fear. Emenike had just killed the chief priest, the most sacred man in the village, in cold blood. It was clear now that he would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as if the entire kingdom had been swallowed by fear. With the threat of death looming over them, the coronation proceeded. The elders, their hands trembling, performed their duties as instructed, not out of loyalty, but out of pure fear. The villagers who had gathered around the palace stood in stunned silence, their minds too numb to process what had just occurred. The once peaceful kingdom of Ora had fallen into the hands of a tyrant, and everyone knew that nothing would ever be the same. Somewhere in the tall palace mansion stood the gorgeous princess Omalicha, gazing out of the window of her room. Since the news of her father's death reached her, she hadn't left her room or eaten anything. Her father, the king, was the only parent she had left, as her mother had died during childbirth a few years ago. She had shared a strong bond with her father, and his death had hit her hard. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she watched from the window what was happening in the palace, her father's kingdom, while the entire village was still in mourning. Anger surged through her, and she had wanted so badly to confront Emenike. But one of her father's loyal guards had warned her. "He will kill you if you try it," he said to her. "Emenike has the heart of a wild beast." So, she just stood by the window, helplessly, watching as her father's throne was being taken away. Her eyes filled with tears, and her heart ached badly. She wondered what her fate would become after this. Would she still be a princess, or would her wicked uncle throw her out of the palace? After the dreadful coronation, Emenike seized control of the kingdom. Even though the sacred offer, the staff of authority, was missing, it didn't matter to him. He crowned himself king anyway, and moved into the grand palace that his younger brother Onwara had built. He brought with him his ill-mannered children and his wicked wife Ojugo. This was the moment he had been waiting for all his life. His eyes gleamed with satisfaction as he paced around the luxurious living room, taking in the gold ornaments, the fine furniture, and the vast wealth that now belonged to him. His heart swelled with pride and greed. All of this is mine now, he thought wickedly, as he admired the grand palace. Onwara thought he could steal my birthright and enjoy the riches of the kingdom all by himself. No, I, Emenike, never give up on what I want. He turned to his children, puffing out his chest with pride. You are now princess, he said to his daughter, his voice thick with arrogance. And your brother here is the prince, the heir to the throne. He laughed wickedly, reveling in the power he had finally grasped. But his daughter, curious and bold, asked, "But father, where is Princess Omalicha?" "Princess who?" Emenike growled. "Listen to me and listen well. You, my daughter, are the only princess of our kingdom now. Omalicha's father took the throne away from me, and I have taken it back. She is no longer a princess." His voice dripped with hatred as he spat out the words. The smile that spread across his daughter's face filled Emenike's heart with twisted joy. She was overjoyed to be the new princess, basking in the thought that everyone would respect her and no one would ever look down on her again. As for Omalicha, Emenike continued, glancing around the palace. "Where is she? I haven't seen her since we arrived." His voice was sharp and laced with impatience. "Bring her to me," he barked at one of the palace maids. Meanwhile, Ojugo, Emenike's wife, sat comfortably on the couch, a satisfied smile playing on her lips. She had long dreamed of this moment, becoming queen, living in luxury, and having the entire kingdom bow at her feet. Her mind wandered into fantasies of power and wealth as she imagined the endless riches they would now control. She was completely lost in her daydreams when the door opened and Princess Omalicha was led into the room. The moment Ojugo saw her, her smile vanished. Anger surged through her as she stared at the girl. Even with her tear-streaked face, Princess Omalicha was breathtakingly beautiful, like a perfect painting come to life. She stood there, looking fragile and broken, yet her beauty shone through her grief. Ojugo's heart twisted with jealousy. Omalicha was everything her own daughter could never be. Emenike's eyes filled with hatred as he looked at the poor princess. "You miserable girl," he said. "Your father is dead," he snarled, his voice cold and heartless, as if trying to deepen her wounds. "As you can see, things have changed around here. You are no longer the princess of our kingdom. Your father took everything from me, but now I have taken it all back." He stared at her with a look so fierce that it made her tremble. "I have been thinking of what to do to you," he continued. "I considered many options, but I decided to be generous. instead of throwing you out of the palace like the worthless pig you are. You will stay here. But from now on, you are nothing more than a maid. You will strip yourself of all your royal clothes and jewelries and live in the servants' quarter. You will serve my family until some foolish man comes along to marry you. If anyone will, he laughed cruelly, the sound echoing off the palace walls. Princess Omalicha stood there, frozen in shock, her legs trembling beneath her. Tears filled her eyes as she fell to her knees, her voice shaking as she pleaded, "Please, uncle." "Uncle?" Emenike roared. "Call me king." His face contorted with rage. He rushed toward her, his hands clenched into fists. "Why did you call me that? What did you just call me?" But before he could strike her, Ojugo jumped to her feet and grabbed his arms. "No, Emenike," she said sharply. "Don't waste your precious hands on this filthy pig. You are now king. She is nothing." Her voice was filled with malice as she shot Omalicha a hateful glare. With a wave of his hands, Emenike commanded one of his guards, "Take her away. Strip her of everything, her royal clothes, her jewelries, and shave off that long hair of hers. She is no longer worthy of it. Dress her in servant's rags and send her to the quarters." The guard obeyed without hesitation, grabbing Princess Omalicha roughly and dragging her out of the room. She cried and pleaded for mercy, her sobs filling the halls of the palace. Under a tree in the palace garden, her hair was shaved off as she cried, tears running down her cheeks. She was now utterly alone, with no one to fight for her, and at the mercy of her heartless uncle. All the beautiful life she had known was now a thing of the past, as she has been reduced to an ordinary maid in her father's palace. A place which was once a happy abode for her, as she danced under the starlit sky at night with her father's laughter echoing through the walls of the palace. Everything was now folded into a collection of memories. The palace maidens stared in horror, unable to believe what they were seeing. The precious and beautiful daughter of their late king, Omalicha, had been reduced to an ordinary maid. Whispers circulated quietly among them. This man must be evil, but none dared to voice their thoughts aloud. The name Emenike alone struck terror into the hearts of everyone in the kingdom. All they could do was watch Omalicha with eyes full of pity, unsure of how to help her. Omalicha, once adored as a princess, had no choice but to accept her new role as a servant. Emenike, in his cruelty, sent away all the maids who had once worked in the vast palace, leaving Omalicha to handle every task on her own. She washed clothes, scrubbed the floors, swept the palace, and cooked meals. These were tasks she had never done before, and often she struggled not knowing how to complete them properly. Ojugo, Emenike's evil wife, took every opportunity to scream at her, her voice filled with hatred. "You hopeless and miserable child," Ojugo would shout, her words cutting deep into Omalicha's already broken heart. "Your father spoiled you so much that you are so useless. You can't do anything right. I will make sure you die miserably, just like your father." Every time Ojugo mentioned her father, fresh tears would roll down Omalicha's cheeks. She missed him so much, and the cruelty of hearing his name in such a hateful way was unbearable. Often, Omalicha would finish all the chores only to find that there was no food. left for her to eat. Emenike and Ojugo were truly heartless, and their wickedness knew no bounds. When Omalicha wasn't working in the palace, she was sent to the fields to work. There she would weep as she walked. She had never known suffering in her life before, but now everything had changed. Her uncle had taken everything from her. Emenike strutted around the palace in her father's royal clothes, while his wife pranced about in her late mother's gowns. And worst of all, his daughter Nebe wore Omalicha's dresses, pretending to be the princess. Every time Omalicha saw this, her heart shattered 1,000 times. She could never have imagined that anyone could be so wicked and heartless. Day after day, Omalicha cried until she had no more tears left. Every evening, as dusk fell, she would gather her basket and return to the palace to continue her endless chores. It was clear to her that their plan was to work her to death. With each passing day, Omalicha grew paler and weaker. She labored tirelessly and was often given little or nothing to eat. As Omalicha passed through the village on her way to and fro from the palace, the villagers would snap their fingers, a gesture of sympathy and sorrow. Their eyes were filled with pity as they watched their once precious and happy princess, now a mere shadow of her former self. "Is this what Emenike has reduced our princess to?" they whispered bitterly. "His slave? The gods will surely punish that evil man," they would curse under their breath. The entire village was suffering under Emenike's reign. It wasn't just Omalicha who felt the weight of his tyranny. The villagers, too, were paying a heavy price for having such a cruel man as their king. King Onwera had been a fair and kind ruler. He never demanded tributes from the people. Instead, he accepted whatever they offered from their hearts. But Emenike was different. He demanded that every villager hand over half of their harvest to the palace. If they refused, their land would be taken away from them, as Emenike claimed that all the land in the kingdom belonged to the king. What had once been a happy and prosperous village was now a place of sorrow. The people worked endlessly, yet had little to show for it. They toiled under the scorching sun, only to have Emenike grow richer from their sweat and tears. He didn't care about their suffering. All he wanted was more wealth, and nothing was ever enough. His greed was insatiable. Sometimes the villagers would come to the palace crying and pleading with the king for his mercy. But Emenike had no mercy in his heart. He would drive them away furiously, ordering his guards to whip them and chase them out. His cruelty knew no bounds. Even his children had inherited his wickedness. They rode through the village on horseback, bullying anyone who dared to show them disrespect. The villagers hated them with a deep passion. But what could they do? Ebuka, Emenike's son, was perhaps the worst of them all. His appetite for women was insatiable. He took advantage of his position as the prince to force any maiden who caught his eyes to sleep with him. His arrogance mirrored his father's, and no girl in the village dared refuse him. If any maiden was brave enough to say no, Ebuka would send his men to capture, beat, and torture her, before he would then force himself on her. It was as if the painful screams of the maidens brought him great pleasure. The soil of the land was filled with tears of the painful atrocities that Emenike and his family inflicted on the people. This kind of abomination had never been seen in the entire history of Ora Kingdom. Reporting Ebuka's atrocities to the king was pointless. No one who entered the palace to complain ever came out the same way. The people were trapped in a nightmare with no escape. Mothers cried, fathers wept, and young men and children shed bitter tears. They did not know how they could ever be free from the terrible wickedness that had taken over their once peaceful land. The Ora kingdom, which had once thrived under King Onwora's gentle reign, was now drowning in misery under Emenike's cruel and oppressive rule. One day, Princess Omalicha became gravely ill. She was so weak that she couldn't even stand, let alone do any of the chores she had been forced to do. Her body trembled uncontrollably as she lay on her cold bare bed, shivering. Ojugo, expecting her to fulfill her duties as usual, noticed her absence, but thought nothing of it at first. But as the day wore on, and Omalicha still hadn't shown up, Ojugo's impatience grew. She sent the guards to check on her. The guards returned with a report: Omalicha is sick, hoping it would explain why she hadn't been able to work. Sick? Ojugo shouted, her voice echoing through the palace halls. What kind of sickness is that? So, because she is sick, my family should starve to death? She must still think she's a princess. Well, I will remind her of her place today. Furious, Ojugo ordered the guards to drag Omalicha out of her room and beat her mercilessly, even in her weakened state. Without hesitation, they obeyed her cruel command. They found Omalicha trembling in her bed, and despite her pitiful condition, they dragged her out onto the open and beat her as Ojugo had ordered. Omalicha cried out in pain, her body too weak to defend itself. But even after the cruel beating, she was forced to continue walking, with tears streaming down her face and her body aching all over. She struggled through the chores, doing the best she could. Meanwhile, Ojugo and her daughter stood over her, taunting and mocking her cruelly. Look at her, Nebe sneered. She still thinks she's important. Yes, Ojugo agreed, laughing wickedly. A former princess, now in the mud. She is nothing more than a miserable servant. That evening, as Omalicha collapsed on the floor of her room, her body aching and bruised, one of the guards, who had served her father for many years, snuck into her quarters. In his hands he carried a small bundle of healing herbs. Your Highness, he whispered softly, using the title she had long been denied. Take this. They will help you ease your pain. His voice was filled with compassion, and his eyes showed the loyalty he still felt towards her. Omalicha took the herbs gratefully, and over the next few days, her health began to improve. The herbs worked their magic, and soon her sickness faded away. But while her body healed, her suffering did not. The cruel treatment continued. Every day was filled with pain, both physical and emotional. Omalicha was exhausted by the torment that had become her life. Each night, she would sit in her cold, empty room staring at the darkness, her heart heavy with despair. She prayed silently, wishing for death to come and take her away from the cruelty that she had found herself in. But death never came. Instead, every new day brought more nightmares, more suffering. It seemed there was no end in sight to the torment she endured at the hands of her wicked uncle and his family. All she had left was her hope that one day, somehow, she might be free from the pain. Months passed, and soon the time of harvest arrived. The villagers, trembling with fear, submitted half of their hard-earned crops to the king as demanded. The palace was overflowing with food. Yams, maize, vegetables and grains stacked high. It seemed there was more than enough to feed an army. But the people who had grown these crops were left with only a fraction of what they needed to survive. One night, as Ojugo and Emenike sat in the palace, the queen looked around at all the food piled up and asked, "What do we do with all this? The palace can't possibly eat all of it. We need to convert them to money." Emenike, never short on cruelty, grinned wickedly. "We are going to sell it," he replied. "That useless girl, Omalicha, will carry it to the markets in the neighboring kingdoms. She will be our seller now. Since there is no more farming to be done this season, let her work even harder." Ojugo's face lit up with a wicked smile. "That's so smart of you," she said, laughing darkly. "We will deal with her until she becomes a living dead." And so, Omalicha's suffering grew even worse. Every day, after completing the endless chores she had now grown used to, she was given a heavy bag of farm produce to carry to distant markets. The weight of the bag was unbearable, and her body, already weakened from months of mistreatment, ached with every step. Her legs felt like they would collapse under her, but she had no choice but to keep going. Omalicha would trudge through the hot sun, making her way to far-off villages to sell the crops. She barely had enough strength to stand, but she had to endure it. At the end of each exhausting day, she would return to the palace, her body trembling with fatigue, and hand over the money she had earned to the king. But no matter how much she brought back, Emenike always found a way to accuse her of stealing. "You are stealing my money," he would shout at her, his voice burning with cruelty. "Bring them out. I know you are keeping some for yourself." Even though Omalicha knew she had given him every single coin, Emenike would still accuse her of theft. He would then order his guards to throw her into a dark cold room where she would be punished. The men, loyal to Emenike's evil will, would whip her and beat her until she was crying uncontrollably. Omalicha would sob into the darkness, her heart breaking with each tear. She knew she hadn't stolen a single thing, but Emenike's cruelty was never about the truth. It was about breaking her spirit, about making her suffer as much as possible. Yet, despite all this, he never allowed her to stop. Day after day, she was forced to go back to the market, carrying the heavy loads and enduring the same terrible accusations. Omalicha's heart grew heavier with each passing day. She wondered how long she could endure this endless suffering. One hot afternoon, in the faraway kingdom where Omalicha had gone to sell farm produce as usual, she sat there feeling depressed, frustrated and utterly fed up with life. As she stared blankly at the goods she had brought, a crowd began to gather nearby, screaming excitedly. The noise didn't move her. It had been a terrible day, and she knew her life would even be more miserable when she returned to the village without selling all her goods. What Omalicha didn't know was that the prince of the kingdom had visited the market. As the people surrounded him, hailing him with admiration, the prince noticed Omalicha sitting quietly in a corner. Something about her caught his attention. She looked so fragile, like she needed help. Deep in her eyes, he saw a heavy sadness, an overwhelming sorrow that was hard to miss. He had never seen this maiden before, and he wondered where she had come from. Intrigued, he moved closer, determined to find out who she was. Stopping beside her, the prince dismounted his horse, much to the surprise of the market women, who watched in awe as their prince approached the mysterious girl. "Beautiful maiden," the prince called out, "I greet you." Omalicha looked up, her expression unchanged. She could tell from his appearance that he was royalty, but she didn't care. What did it matter? Her life was already miserable, and nothing seemed to matter to her anymore. Something softened in the prince's eyes. He couldn't just leave her like this. "Can I talk to you in private?" he asked, noticing the curious eyes of the market women on her. "My uncle will kill me if I return with any of this farm produce," she replied coldly. "Today has been a very bad day." The prince studied her face for a moment and then said, "I will buy it all. I will pay you twice its worth. You don't have to worry." For the first time, Omalicha looked up fully, noticing the prince's kind expression. His soft voice and gentle words touched her heart. For a brief moment, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Kindness. She nodded gently and slowly. The prince lifted her onto his horse as they rode to his palace. Omalicha was starving, and the prince noticed this without her saying a word. He offered her food, which she quickly devoured. It had been ages since she had had a good meal. The prince watched her, his eyes filling with tears, as he wondered what pain she had endured. Afterward, they sat in the palace garden, where the prince spoke softly. "So tell me, who are you?" Tears filled Omalicha's eyes. Did she even know who she was anymore? A princess or a maid? The question terrified her. "Hey," the prince said gently. "There's no need to cry. I'm here to help you. Tell me, what's wrong? I can see you carry a heavy burden." Omalicha didn't know why, but something pushed her to open up. Perhaps it was a prince's calm voice, or maybe it was something else entirely. She told him everything, from the sudden death of her father to how her uncle had taken over her father's throne, turning her into a maid and torturing the entire village. Prince Ikemba couldn't hold back his tears as he listened to her story. Never had he heard of such cruelty. It explained the deep pain he had seen in her eyes. "You are a strong woman," he said, looking into her eyes. "I've never seen anyone as strong as you. But how can I free you from your uncle's grip?" Omalicha wiped her eyes. "He said I'll be free when a useless man comes to marry me. But I know no man will. Look at me. What man would marry me in this state? Not even the most useless of them all." The prince looked at her. "You're beautiful, and there is nothing wrong with you. When I look at you, I see beauty. Marry me," he said. "What?" Omalicha asked, shocked by his words. "Yes, marry me. I don't want you to suffer anymore. I want you to find peace and live your life." "No," Omalicha replied softly. "I can't pin this on you. It's not your fault that I'm going through this. I don't want a man to marry me out of pity. I want a man who sees me and loves me." "Omalicha," the prince said, leaning closer, "you are not the only sad girl in the market, but I picked you. I saw something in you that I've never seen in anyone else. I know I will be happy with you. Yes, I pity you, but I want to do this because I love you." Tears filled Omalicha's eyes once again. Then, I will marry you if you love me, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. Prince Ikemba took her hands. I will speak with my father. In the next 14 days, I will come to see your people. He gave her the money he had promised her and rode her close to her kingdom before turning back. As Omalicha walked home, her mind was racing. Was this real? Could it all be a dream? How could a handsome and strong prince like Ikemba look at her and ask for her hand in marriage, just like that? That night, as she lay on her bed, all she could think of was Ikemba. His soft voice, his kind eyes. 14 days suddenly felt like 14 years. For the first time in a long while, Omalicha had hope. She believed her suffering might finally come to an end, and this gave her a new strength to keep going. Ikemba was the first son of Amadike, the king of Ikaland, a powerful and prosperous kingdom known for its rich soil and fearless warriors. His father was surprised by his sudden interest in a total stranger. Are you sure you love her enough to marry her? The king asked his son. Yes, father, Ikemba replied firmly. The king was silent for a while. Very well, my son, the king said, finally, trusting his son's wisdom. For Ikemba was known for making sound decisions. Word was sent to the king of Ora that in 12 days the prince of Ika would come to ask for the hand of the princess in marriage. Emenike could not contain his excitement. He believed the princess they talked about was his daughter Nebe, who was to marry the great prince of Ika. Oh, I must have done something good in my previous life to win the affection of the gods, he thought proudly. Nebe too was overwhelmed with joy. She had heard tales about Princess Ikemba's handsomeness and strength, and she couldn't wait to meet him. As Omalicha slaved away for the family, Nebe couldn't stop boasting about her upcoming marriage. I am getting married to the Prince of Ika soon, she would say, while you will be a slave for the rest of your life. Omalicha remained silent, saying nothing in response. Finally, the long-awaited day came. The king of Ika, along with Prince Ikemba and the elders, arrived in Ora to ask for Omalicha's hand in marriage. Emenike and Ojugo proudly paraded Nebe before them, but Ikemba shook his head. No, he said firmly, this is not the princess I want. Everyone was thrown into confusion as they looked at the prince. I have only one daughter, Emenike protested, and I've shown her to you. Just then, Omalicha stepped out to serve them cola. Princess Ikemba's eyes lit up. It's her! She's the one I want, he said excitedly. Emenike and Ojugo's eyes twisted with anger. You can't marry her. She's just a maid, Emenike shouted, his voice laced with frustration. He had never imagined that the princess they had spoken of was Omalicha. How had Princess Ikemba known her? It is this maid that I love, Ikemba said, standing his ground. Name your price, and I will pay it. The king of Ora forced a smile, trying to hide his shame. Don't you think you are too good for her? He asked, his voice shaking. No, I can never be too good for the woman I love, Ikemba replied. Okay then, Emenike nodded, though his heart burned with anger. As they discussed the marriage rites and shared laughter, Emenike's heart seethed with rage. He hid it behind a forced smile. King Emenike and Queen Ojugo paced around their room, their face twisted in anger. After the men from Ika left, they were boiling with frustration. What was supposed to be a day of victory had turned into a bitter disappointment. The prince had chosen Omalicha over their daughter, and neither of them could accept it. "That girl will never get married before our daughter," Ojugo screamed, her voice trembling with fury. "Who does she think she is?" She turned to her husband, her eyes blazing with frustration. "I told you, we should have gotten rid of that girl long ago. But you said no. You said turning her into a slave would be more fun. Well, look at where she's gotten us. This is no longer fun, my king. There is no joy in this anymore." "Will you shut up, woman?" Emenike barked, his voice booming through the room. "Who told you I'm going to stand by and watch her get married? There is no way this is happening. Don't you know me anymore? Don't you know who your husband is? I have already decided she will end up just like her father." Ojugo turned sharply, her mind racing. "But that's not smart. How will we explain to the people of Ika that she suddenly disappeared? They are coming back in 2 days." Emenike's lips curled into a smile. "Do you think I'm just going to tell them she's missing? No. Give me some credit, woman." Ojugo's eyes lit up with understanding. She laughed wickedly, catching onto her husband's plan. "Yes, the marriage will still happen," she said, her face darkening with a cruel smile. Very early the next morning, the day of Omalicha's traditional marriage rites, she lay in bed, wide awake. Sleep had evaded her as she counted the hours ticking by, her heart filled with nervous anticipation. Soon, she would be free from this life of suffering, free from the clutches of her cruel uncle. The thought of leaving brought her some comfort, but the weight of the villagers' suffering tugged at her heart. She wished that somehow, rescue would come for them as well. The people needed a savior as much as she did. Just as these thoughts filled her mind, a soft knock came at her door. Omalicha's heart raced. Who could it be this early hour? Cautiously, she got up, put on her clothes and opened the door slightly. Before she could even react, 2 masked men grabbed her, covering her mouth to silence her screams. She struggled against them, but they were too strong. Fear flooded Omalicha's mind, and she knew immediately that this was her uncle's doing. She had seen the hatred burning in his eyes, but she never imagined he would go this far to sabotage her marriage. As tears rolled down her cheeks, she thought, what have my parents ever done to deserve this wickedness? The men dragged her through the dark pathways, heading towards the forest. Omalicha's heart sank as she realized where they were taking her to. The dense forest stretched for miles, a place where no one would ever think to search. Desperation filled her as they walked deeper into the forest. As the day began to break, she reached for the bracelet Princess Ikemba had given her just days before. She slipped it off and dropped it quietly along the path, hoping it might be a clue for someone to find her. She just didn't know how, but she had hope. The men walked for what felt like hours, taking her deep into the heart of the forest, far from any hope of rescue. Finally, they stopped at a hidden spot covered with leaves. One of the men cleared away the foliage, revealing a small hidden door in the ground. Omalicha's heart pounded in terror. They opened the door and climbed down into what seemed like an underground cave, forcing her to follow. Inside the cave was damp and cold, lit only by the faint glow of a small lamp. The air was thick with the smell of earth and decay. The men pushed her into a small dark room and climbed back up, sealing the entrance behind them. Omalicha was left alone in the dark, her heart racing with fear. She screamed and pounded on the walls, her voice echoing in the silence. But it was useless. No one could hear her. Her screams turned into sobs as she collapsed on the cold floor. her hands bruised from hitting the stone walls. Panic gripped her as she realized just how trapped she was. Then, in the stillness of the cave, she felt something cold touch her shoulder. A hand. Her body froze in terror. Slowly, she turned to see who or what had touched her. But as soon as she set her eyes on the figure in darkness, her vision blurred and she passed out, the weight of fear and terror overwhelming her. Ojigbo and Emenike were filled with joy, convinced that their evil plan had worked flawlessly. With Omalicha hidden away in a dark forest cave, they carried on with their grand preparations for the marriage ceremony, confident that their daughter Nebe would soon be crowned princess of Ika. Nebe was dressed in a stunning African print dress, her face completely covered by a veil. She sat eagerly beside her parents, waiting for the arrival of Prince Ikemba and his people. Before long, the sound of drums and horses filled the air as the prince and his entourage arrived at the palace. The whole village was bustling with excitement. Music echoed through the streets. The people gathered to witness the union, not knowing what had happened. Silently, they were excited that Omalicha was finally free from the strong grip of her evil uncle. The elders were seated, watching as the marriage rites were about to begin. Prince Ikemba had brought everything necessary for the ceremony and even more. His gifts were plentiful, and the king and queen of Ora couldn't stop smiling. Feeling victorious in their deception, the queen's eyes gleamed with pride as everything went smoothly, just as they had planned. Once the formalities were complete, the queen sent for Nebe, who remained veiled the entire time. Nebe's heart raced with excitement as she was led out to stand before Prince Ikemba. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The crowd clapped and cheered. She could hardly contain her joy. Her parents had truly outsmarted everyone, and soon she would be married to the handsome and powerful prince. Prince Ikemba, however, couldn't help but feel uneasy. He kept glancing at the veiled bride, wondering why she remained covered even after the ceremony. It was strange to him, but before he could ask, the queen, who had noticed his uneasiness, quickly stepped in, smiling warmly. "It's our tradition," she explained. "This shows that the bride is pure." Nebe stood there, her excitement bubbling beneath the veil. She felt triumphant. Her parents had succeeded in pulling off this great deception, and she was moments away from becoming the wife of a prince. She had already begun to dream of her new life as a royalty. As the ceremony came to a close, Prince Ikemba and his people prepared to take their new bride back to Ika. Nebe, still veiled, was led away with them as the crowd cheered and music filled the air. The journey back seemed smooth, and everything appeared to be going as planned, until they were suddenly stopped on the road. A man came rushing towards them, his face filled with panic. It was Uwa, the village palm wine tapper. His eyes were wide with fear, and his breath came in ragged gasps. "Stop! Stop!" he shouted, his voice trembling. "You've married the wrong girl." Prince Ikemba halted his horse, confusion flashing across his face. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his heart beginning to race. Owa, still panting, reached into his pocket and pulled out a small bead. "I found this in the forest," he said, holding it up for the prince to see. "This morning, I saw the king's men take the real princess into the forest. I followed them, but they didn't know I was there. They've hidden her in a cave, far away in the forest, far from the village." Ikemba's heart pounded as he stared at the bead in Uwa's hand. It was the same bead he had given to Omalicha just days ago. Without a moment's hesitation, Ikemba jumped down from his horse and walked straight to the veiled girl, standing among his people. He reached up and pulled off the veil, revealing Nebe, Emenike's daughter, not Princess Omalicha. A wave of shock rippled through the crowd. Gasps filled the air as everyone realized the truth. Prince Ikemba's face twisted with anger, his heart burning with betrayal. Emenike should have known better than to deceive the people of Ika, he said, his voice filled with fury. If anything happens to Omalicha, I will wipe out his entire family. Without wasting another second, Ikemba ordered all his men to hasten to Ika. Upon returning to the village, they quickly gathered more men and without hesitation headed straight for the forest where Uwa said Omalicha was hidden, with Uwa leading the way. Ikemba's mind raced as they rode through the thick trees. He could only imagine the terror Omalicha must be feeling, trapped in the darkness of that cave. Nebe was thrown into a small dim room, her body aching from the beating the palace guards had given her. Fear gripped her tightly and her mind raced with terror. She had never imagined things would go this wrong, but what was she even thinking? As she sat trembling, waiting for Prince Ikemba's return and decision, thoughts of her parents' plan filled her with regret. How could she have gone along with such a foolish idea? Now, she feared for her life, wondering if the prince would demand her execution for the deception. Meanwhile, Prince Ikemba and his men marched towards the forest, led by Uwa, the palm wine tapper. Uwa knew the forest well, having traveled its paths many times, but even he had never known about an underground cave hidden deep within it. The sun had already begun to set and the thick trees cast long shadows, making the forest dim and eerie. Still, the men pressed on, determined to find Omalicha before it was too late. Ikemba's heart was heavy with worry, and silently he prayed to the gods, hoping that Omalicha was still alive. The thought of her being harmed or worse was too painful to bear. The kind of wickedness her uncle had shown was beyond anything he had ever imagined. Finally, after what felt like hours walking through the darkening forest, they reached the spot. It was a secluded area far from any path, and a sturdy padlock secured the entrance to the underground cave. The men quickly went to work, using a large saw to break open the lock. Once the entrance was free, they shone their torches into the cave, but the darkness seemed to swallow the light. They could see nothing. Without hesitation, Ikemba along with a few warriors climbed down into the cave, through a set of steep, makeshift steps. The air was cold and damp, and a foul smell hung in the air. As they moved deeper into the cave, they came upon a room. It was littered with dirty plates and uneaten food, as if someone had been living there for a long time in misery. The men glanced at each other, their minds racing with questions. Who had been staying here? Ikemba's torch flickered as he turned the light towards the far end of the room. And there, in the shadows, lay Omalicha. Relief washed over him for a brief moment, but then he saw something that made his heart race even faster. Omalicha was not alone. An elderly man with long, scraggly beard sat beside her, holding her in his arms. The man was awake, but Omalicha was asleep, resting her arms against him. Who is he? Ikemba thought, feeling a mix of confusion and concern. He stepped closer and kneeled beside Omalicha, gently tapping her shoulder. Omalicha, Omalicha, he whispered gently. It's me, Ikemba. I'm here to rescue you. At the sound of his voice, Omalicha's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, she stared at him, her mind groggy and disoriented. But when she finally realized who was standing before her, tears welled up in her eyes. Ikemba too was overcome with emotion, his own eyes filling with tears as he embraced her tightly. "Let's get out of this stinking place," Ikemba said softly, helping her to her feet. With the assistance of the warriors, they began to climb out of the cave. Omalicha, weak but finally free. The elderly man, looking worn and sickly, struggled to his feet as well. The men held him and helped him out of the cave. As soon as they were out and Uwa caught sight of him, his eyes widened in shock as he recognized him instantly. "It's the king!" Uwa shouted, his voice filled with disbelief. "The king is alive! King Onwara is alive!" The men stopped in their tracks, stunned by Uwa's word. They looked closely at the elderly man. Indeed, it was King Onwara, Omalicha's father, who everyone had believed to be dead. He had been hidden away all this time, imprisoned in a dark cave by Emenike's wicked scheme. Omalicha was too weak to speak, but the joy in her eyes was unmistakable. Her father was alive. She had thought him dead, but now, against all odds, he was standing before her. It looked like a miracle. They quickly helped both Omalicha and King Onwara onto horses. King Onwara was happy to receive fresh air after what had seemed like ages. It gave him new strength. With haste, the group galloped back towards the village. Owa, still in shock, didn't stop shouting the news all the way back. His voice, filled with excitement, rang through the quiet night air. As they approached the village, the warriors joined in, shouting in unison. The sound echoed across the village, loud enough for everyone to hear. People began to stir from their homes, wondering what had happened. Owa's cries, "The king is alive! The king is alive!" reached every corner of the village, and soon crowds began to gather. The once silent village was now filled with loud, joyous shouts of warriors and villagers alike. Everyone wanted to see the miracle that had happened, the return of their beloved King Onwara and the rescue of Princess Omalicha. As they rode into the heart of the village, it was clear that this night would go down in history. The long reign of fear and sorrow was finally coming to an end. The villagers, overwhelmed with joy and excitement, began to march out of their homes in large numbers, each person carrying a lamp to light the way. As they ran towards the gathering crowd, they saw King Onwara and immediately they recognized him. The king, whom they thought was long dead, was alive. Shouts of jubilation filled the air as more and more villagers joined the procession. The crowd grew larger, their voices louder as they marched towards the palace, determined to confront the evil that had ruled over them for too long. In the palace garden, Emenike and his wife Ojugo were lounging comfortably, sipping wine and celebrating their perceived victory. They laughed heartily, convinced that they had outsmarted everyone. Finally, Ojugo said with a smug smile, "We have married off our daughter to a prince, and when we die, our son will be king. What a future we've secured for them." Indeed, Emenike agreed. I added some charm into her bathing water, and when the king set his eyes on her, he's going to forget all about Omalicha in an instant. They chuckled as they clinked their glasses together. They were basking in their success, believing that nothing could ruin their plans. But their celebration was cut short when a palace guard came running towards them, his face pale with panic. My king, the guard shouted breathlessly. There is a loud noise. A crowd of villagers is heading towards the palace. Emenike scolded, irritated by the interruption. And so, he barked angrily. Can't you see I'm enjoying a fine evening with the queen? Tell the guards to get their whips ready and chase those miscreants away. The guards hesitated, his voice trembling. No, my king. This time it's different. They are accompanied by warriors from Ika. And I think, you think what? Emenike snapped. You think what? His patience wearing thin. The guard stammered. They found the dead king and his daughter. At those words, Emenike and Ojugo leaped to their feet, their faces drained of color. No, this can't be, Emenike shouted, his voice filled with panic. This can't be happening. Get me my sword. Call my chief guard now. As the shouts from the crowd grew louder, the noise deafening, and Emenike realized that the villagers had surrounded the palace. They were chanting angrily, holding large stones in their hands, waiting for Emenike to appear. Inside the palace, Ojugo and her son had already fled to hide somewhere, terrified of what was coming. But Emenike, in his arrogance, believed he still had control over the people. He walked towards the gate, with his head held high, thinking that his power over them had not faded. By now, the villagers had heard the truth from King Onwara himself. He had told them how Emenike had lured him into the forest under the pretense of inspecting a land. Once they were deep in the woods, Emenike's hired thugs had ambushed him, bundling him deeper into the forest and throwing him into a dungeon that he had prepared beforehand. The villagers were horrified. They couldn't believe that Emenike, the king's own brother, had betrayed him so cruelly. Even though Emenike had sent food to the dungeon occasionally, it was clear that his plan had been for his brother to die slowly in pain and suffering. And as if that wasn't enough, he had also thrown his niece, Princess Omalicha, into the same dungeon. This man is a monster, the villagers whispered to one another. He doesn't deserve to live. Their disbelief turned into rage. How could he do this to his own family? As Emenike stepped out, still shouting and backing others, the villagers erupted in fury. They pounced on him without hesitation, pelting him with stones from all directions. The angry crowd gave him no space to escape, their rage uncontainable. They made sure that Emenike was stoned to death right there outside the palace gates. As they chanted in unison, their voices filled with both relief and vengeance. Once he was dead, they dragged his body to the evil forest where he would be left to rot. That was where people like him belonged. Nebe had been dragged back to her village. Inside the palace, Ojugo, her son, and the thugs who had helped carry out Emenike's wicked plans were found hiding. They were all captured together by the furious villagers. No mercy was shown to them. The villagers decided that they would all be locked up in the same dungeon in the forest where King Onwara and Omalicha had been held. It was a fitting punishment for the cruelty they had inflicted. As they were being dragged to the forest, Ojugo and her children cried and pleaded for mercy, but the villagers were too enraged to listen. Their pleas fell on deaf ears. The villagers' hearts were filled with all the suffering and pain that Emenike and his family had inflicted on them. They were glad to see justice being served. They had suffered for too long under this tyranny, and now they would rot in the very pits they had used to torment others. The land would finally be cleansed from all the evil Emenike had brought upon it. And as the villagers watched Ojugo and her children disappear into the darkness of the forest, they knew that their kingdom would finally begin to heal from the pain and suffering they had endured for years. The king was carefully quarantined and placed under the care of the village herbalist. His body, weakened from a few years of captivity, needed healing, and he was given special herbs and treatment to restore his strength. Omalicha, though shaken from her own ordeal, required only mild medication. Unlike her father, she had not been in the dungeon for long. despite the king's frailty when first rescued. His body responded quickly to treatment. He was a strong man, and his will to live for his people gave him strength to recover rapidly. Months passed, and soon the king had regained his full health. He was fit and ready to resume his duties on the throne. The day of his return was one of immense joy. The entire village came alive with excitement. Drums rolled through the air and music echoed throughout the palace and beyond. It felt like a grand festival, with everyone gathered to celebrate the return of their beloved king. The streets were filled with dancing, laughter and smiles as the villagers expressed their happiness. King Onora stood before his people, tears welling in his eyes. He had never imagined he would see the joyous faces of the villagers again after all the pain and suffering. He had heard of their hardship and sufferings under Emenike's cruel reign, and his heart ached for all they had endured. Now, as he looked at the love and loyalty surrounding him, he silently prayed to the gods to grant him more years to rule them with justice and peace. Among the villagers was Onowu, the king's trusted advisor, who had heard of his return and rushed back to the village with his family. When the king saw Onowu, his face lit up with joy. They embraced tightly, both of them grateful to be reunited after so much time apart. Onowu had remained loyal, while the other elders who had been bribed and worked with Emenike stood off to the side, their heads bowed in shame. They couldn't meet the king's eyes, knowing that they had betrayed him. As King Onora sat on his throne once more, a miraculous thing happened. The Ofo, the sacred staff of authority, reappeared by his side. The crowd erupted into cheers, shouting with joy. The Ofo's return was a sign from the gods that peace and order had been restored to Ora Kingdom. The people danced and clapped, their hearts full of hope for a brighter future. Owa, the humble palm wine tapper, who had played such a crucial role in saving the king and Omalicha, was greatly rewarded for his bravery. The king called him forward and showered him with gifts, expressing his deep gratitude. "You have not only saved my life," the king said, his voice thick with emotion, "but you've saved the kingdom of Ora. For that, I will forever be in your debt." Owa, overwhelmed with the king's generosity, bowed low, grateful for the honor. Prince Ikemba and his people were also honored that day. King Onora could hardly find the words to express his gratitude. He thanked Ikemba from the depths of his heart for all he had done to rescue his daughter and bring peace to the land. "I bless your union with my daughter," the king declared, raising his hands in blessing. "May your reign be filled with peace, love, and prosperity." Turning to Ikemba, the king smiled warmly. "Take my daughter," he said, his voice soft but full of love. "All I ask is that you cherish her and take good care of her. She is my most precious treasure, the only thing I have left in this world." Ikemba knelt before the king and promised, "I will love her with all my heart. I will protect her, and I will care for her. I will also treat her with the respect she deserves." Omalicha stood nearby, her heart full as she listened to Ikemba's words. This time, she knew without a doubt that he loved her, not out of pity, but truly for who she was. She could see it in the way he looked at her, even when he thought she wasn't watching. His eyes held warmth and admiration, and she felt safe in his love. From that day forward, the kingdom of Ora returned to its former glory. The land was once again peaceful, and the people lived without fear. Omalicha and Ikemba, now king and queen, ruled with kindness and wisdom. Their reign was prosperous, and under their leadership, their kingdom thrived. Each day, Ikemba found new reasons to love Omalicha. seeing in her the same purity and goodness that her father had always shown. She was not only beautiful on the outside, but her spirit was gentle and her heart full of compassion. He was glad he made the right choice. Their love grew stronger with each passing day, and the people of Ika knew that they had found true leaders in their king and queen. Omalicha had not only been saved from the hands of her wicked uncle, but had found a life of happiness and peace alongside the man who truly loved her. And so, they lived happily ever after. Their story, a beacon of hope for the kingdom. Hi besties! Thank you so much for watching this amazing story. And I hope you enjoyed it as much as we enjoyed making it. I would love you to share your lessons in the comments section. And don't forget to subscribe if you are yet to subscribe. Also, turn on your notification bell so that you get notified whenever we post new stories. Thank you so much for all your support, your kind words and your encouragement. They mean so much to me and I can't even thank you enough. Right now, I'll have to go and see you in our next story. Bye!